Hi, I'm Michael Joy. Welcome to another reaction video. I want to say up front here, if you're a subscriber or catching this video randomly, just know that this is a mold making video. We make a lot of content here, and I'm a professional mold maker, and so you may or may not want to be on this bus if you're interested in some other things. But for the makers out there, get ready. Good morning. We're making another mold making reaction education video today, but it's silicone. The other evening I was looking at some things and saw some that looked well produced, and I thought, let's look at these. I like people who are making nice things. Let's get started.
One of the most important
they had a logo.
When you've got your life cast is obviously to make a master mold of it. Now you don't want to take your original life cast and start working on that necessarily, because
we should do some body casting, right? Teach that.
Life cast, because it's the only one you have.
Not the face, not the face.
Take your life cast, clean it up, get rid of any imperfections, any air bubbles or any artifacts like seam lines or lines that you will have accumulated during the casting process.
I have a lot to say about body casting. I'll do some videos about that.
Nice and clean and ready to go. Then you would do what is known as a master mold.
It looks like he's done this a lot of times, so.
And you would then make a copy of this plaster face. So that
that's a heavy mold. Okay.
And a really nice mold.
Let's see how this goes.
Duplicates later in different materials.
This is the preview.
Let's pop over to the workshop and have a look at the different processes and materials involved in making a simple
master mold. Okay, so I don't really call it a master mold. Mold makers use different vocabularies. It's not really critical unless you're talking to another mold maker and they're like, master mold, what are you talking about? I'll use my vocabulary when his is there because I need to establish my vocabulary for the instructions coming forward.
So the silicone that I'm using here,
put your bag in a scale, you hear me talking about that.
8-1, which is a sort of generic molding silicone.
Because this looks like a pretty decently made mold for people that are in the special effects industry, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about stuff. Dow Corning silicone I used a lot in a day, but I actually had trouble with the company itself, meaning it was difficult to purchase from. Everything was like buying from a science lab, and there was not a lot of love for artists. There was not a lot of support there. So the material was okay, but
which a lot of people use, and the catalyst here you can see is blue, and when you mix this into the silicone, it will obviously go smooth color. So that's how you know when you mixed it properly.
The pigmentation is nice, very helpful.
It's even color. So this mold here, this is the plaster face core that I've got.
This is what I call the model, the three-dimensional object. He's already put it onto the workboard very cleanly. What I can't see is if he has ventilation holes underneath. A lot of mold makers don't know to vent your workboard. And when you have a plaster mold, there's it wants to breathe. Atmospherically, whether it's drying or whether it's interacting with the humidity. So you always have to perforate your workboard below, and he's prepped this model out.
And this is
to taper it.
Plaster face that I've cleaned up. I've dressed the sides down with more plaster. Sometimes people do this with clay, but I like to do it with plaster. And it just gives you a nice, neat, smooth finish all the way around.
I like cleaning that up with plaster as well, because what happens is after you're done with the mold making process, you still have a plaster body. You have the plaster model. If it was in clay, it would be kind of a fragment. So this is good.
Outside. And I've attached it to a board, a baseboard here, which is basically some chipboard or furniture
shelving
board. And the important thing about this is that it's not porous. It's actually covered with a Formica kind of plastic coating, and that allows me to be able to work on here.
I feel like he's moderating a chess tournament. He has that quiet voice.
And peel stuff off without it actually bonding to the surface. So what I'm doing here is I'm drizzling on the first layer of silicone, and I'm using the tongue stick or wooden.
I don't think you really need to drizzle. It looks pretty, but you can take a brush and just brush it on too. You'll be fine.
Tongue depressor to just drizzle it all over the surface and massage it into the deep areas.
Massage it. There's some people who want to work like a chef and use their hands in everything. My recommendation is not, because you're handling chemistry, and I just wouldn't get used to handling chemistry with my hand. Just mentally, I would always think, no, if I'm wearing gloves, it's because I want to protect myself from something.
It's in the corners of the lips and places.
You can use compressed air.
Expect to get air.
Brush.
You would trap air during this part of the process.
It's well filmed.
It's particularly tricky as well, because as you can see,
the ears, those are always a problem. I'll talk about those.
And go downwards because of gravity, but obviously I need it to go up into the corners of the ears and underneath and all those tricky areas. So this is going to take a few layers to achieve, But the idea is to
Use a brush, not a stick.
whole thing.
Use a brush, not your hands.
Onto the base as well. We actually want to extend.
Something else he should have done for this type of mold is, before he started, he could have drawn a perimeter around the model. So he always stays oriented with how thick the silicone is as it begins to build up and pool around the bottom. Right now, this model is going to become visually blocked in, and he's not going to know kind of how far away he is. And then he's going to have to rely on a sense of touch, which is very misleading in this instance. Also, he's got gloves on, but he's got a long sleeve shirt, so you can be dragging that into your mold surface. A chef's jacket oftentimes has short sleeves because they don't want their cuffs in the food. Same thing with mold maker. Here I am in long sleeves today, but I'm just talking.
Low all the way around, because this is going to be, unfortunately, it's called a flange.
That's a beast.
This flange area here is something that we can
Too stiff, too stiff.
open up the mold later, so it's good to make sure that your silicone extends all the way down to the base and onto the board.
He's right about that.
I'm using an air gun, just an empty, there's nothing in it, it's just an airbrush that's been connected to a compressor.
If he had put the silicone in a degassing chamber, that's I call it a vacuum chamber, that would have been the best way. He could have just put it on and drizzled it around.
Using it to blow air onto the surface, and what this is doing is it's helping to pop any air bubbles that might be trapped in there, and it just goes.
It's not a bad technique.
Blow out these air.
Just use low pressure. If you use too high pressure, you're gonna
First coat all over.
scatter
When
it.
that's all over and done, I'm just going to leave that to go. It's going to take a couple of hours to set, so I just go make myself a cup of tea while that's all setting.
Cup of tea.
And then we'll come back to this for cast layer number 2. Now, unfortunately, on here, you'll see I've got some tiny...
That's normal. I call them snots.
I think it's to do with the way that when I work with
Oh, that's not normal.
plaster, I always soak the plaster overnight to make sure it's completely saturated.
I don't know that soaking would have been such a great idea for making a silicone mold. The ventilation would have helped, but I simply would have put a release agent onto the model. There's a product called polyurethane parting compound. It was the best release agent that I used, but he could have used Vaseline. The trick with using Vaseline is you take a heat gun into the little tub of Vaseline and you liquefy it, and then you use a brush and you brush it in, and then you polish it out with a towel. If you put Vaseline on too heavy, it creates a cake and will cover up your skin detail. You don't want that.
And I think basically the air,
He's got a lot of problems to deal with now.
the plaster,
Right out of the gate. Sorry, guy.
by that first layer.
Call me. No.
What I ended up doing is when that first layer had set, I just
Yeah.
went around with a pair of tiny nail scissors
It's a wet mold that's unventilated.
so that when the next coat of silicone went over the top, it covered them over. So on this next layer of silicone here, you can see I've put some pigment into it so that I can see.
Nice.
I think it's very important
This is,
to accidentally miss somewhere. So if the
between layers you need color differentiation.
colour, you wouldn't necessarily see where I'd gone. So here you can see quite clearly the darker layer is showing up against the.
It's like you turn the lights out in the studio.
I've been and I'm
Is it really dark or just a screen?
again making sure to take
This working with your hands thing, I'm gonna have to stop talking about it because it's just, it gets me worked up. Don't do this.
those awkward areas like under the ear and those tiny little sort of overhangs and undercuts where it's very difficult to actually even see.
If you're working with your hands, you're constantly adjusting your pressure, and basically you can drag the material off the model or you can put too much on the model. There's really, your hands are rounded. You want to use a brush or a spatula or a knife or something like this. With the liquid coats especially, they're not easy to control until you add a thixotropic agent, but to make it a little marshmallowy. This is, it's like finger painting.
Much as you can and expect to sort of scoop it back on top. We've got a good hour or two with this silicone, so I'm not in a hurry with it, but you just want to make sure that you do get it all the way up inside those nooks and crannies, because it's very easy to miss those bits.
I mean, it looks good, but there's a lot of issues he's setting himself up for. This will be one of them. Look at his hands. How many gloves does he go through?
Air onto it to sort of ensure that I don't trap any air bubbles and to try and.
What happens is he's putting a glaze coat on, then he's putting the air so close to it, he's really just displacing the glaze coat to go back down, and the glaze coat ends up being less than a millimeter.
Get as nice a surface as possible.
It'll work, but this is extra effort.
Air bubbles are being persistent, and so what I've done is I've gone in very carefully with a pair of nail scissors and just trimmed them off carefully to expose
you imagine?
the tops. And the next layer of silicone I should put on there, I'm just going to massage into these little holes just to ensure. It's a bit of a nuisance.
So he's already correcting problems right now.
But it is
They're small problems.
careful bit of snipping and some nail scissors.
We use curved tipped Fisker scissors. They're better.
To deal with the numerous tiny little bubbles was to use a small blowtorch that I've got, like a creme brulee.
There's a scale when somebody like does something stupid and then they pay a price for it. What is that called? It's like when you see the guy and he's breaking into a bank from the outside on the security camera and he throws a rock at the glass, but the glass is actually acrylic, and then the rock comes back and it hits him in the head. This is what these torches can do. I watch a lot of chefs work with these torches. I have a business in the culinary industry, so I got a lot of years with chefs. And these torches, or worse yet, the big butane ones with the going like this, you can lean into your own flame because they're very quiet. It's easy to forget they're there because you see the tank. This is really easy to set aside, whatever, start a fire. I just would not bring any flame into the mold making process. If it was a heat gun, that's as far as I would go.
And a torch.
This is a terrible idea.
You blast those bubbles very quickly, just to sort of bake the tops off, and then you can kind of rub the tops, and then they kind of break away, and that worked quite well.
He's making it sound like, oh, this happens to everybody. It doesn't. It happens to him because he's what he's doing.
Next mix, I'm going to do
Put your scale in a bag.
So as you can see, I'm measuring this out into a larger paint kettle, and I weigh everything out. It's very important that you weigh stuff. You don't just
it is.
ball it. You want to be accurate, that your catalyst is the right. This particular catalyst is measured out at 10% by weight. So whatever the volume is.
Yeah, 10 to 1. 1,000 grams base, 100 grams catalyst.
What that is in.
Most manufacturers give you a little extra catalyst. This is a terrible idea. Again, I want to say it a lot of times, even though I just can't let it go. The idea that I had as a mold maker in my studio is I should never have to touch silicone. And that's not a prima donna thing. It's that I'm working on too many damn projects at the same time. I got to go answer the phone. I got people to talk to. I got keyboards that I'm going on in between. I don't need this. My shop was also an office. It wasn't just a messy shop. So the minute you start reaching in here, you're done for the day. With this gloves, I would be using a drill and a mixer, and I would just mix this up in no time, throw it in the vacuum chamber, and there we go. I think he's going to add a thixotropic element to it, additive.
Catalyst. And again, you've got to be
It's pretty, it's sensual, but it's stupid.
the bottom of the bucket and scrape the corners to make sure.
And the thing is when somebody watches a pro do something like this, they think it's okay. It's not.
And then,
This has tin, some of them have platinum in them. You don't want those.
When
okay.
that's done, I'm now going to add a thixotropic.
I'm bad about this.
Diameter, which is the.
There's ways to make liquid silicone thixotropic. Thixotropic simply means like a paste. And it's very helpful because if you saw him, he kept putting silicone on and it would just run off. But if it's thixotropic, it's peanut butter, it's marshmallow. And you can paint it on and it stays. What I would have done is, well, let me finish my first thought. So there's these additives, they're very convenient. The thing is I found they shorten the life of the silicone. Somehow they attack the integrity of the silicone and your molds don't last as long. Because I had a proper shop and proper ventilation, I used fumed, it was called Cabasil, fumed silica. I don't recommend it for any DIYer because it's hazardous. But under good conditions, it was the best filler that I found to use. And it sounds strange to recommend such a hazardous thing, but I would not have mixed this much silicone up to add a thixotropic element. I would have made a cup because you remember he had the ears, he had the nose, he had the eyes, he had this, he had all these high points. I would have mixed up a small amount, thixotropic, and put it on all the high points, all the cavities, let it set, and then I come over it again because now he's going to be babysitting areas that he shouldn't have to 2 or 3 times. You do it once and you're done.
For their silicones. It works really well in both.
He needs a stick. You should never shake your material. It can fling off, it's going to fling on your neck. Now he just grabbed it.
Mixed it into a kind of a paste, like a kind of a thick mayonnaise-y kind of consistency. And it's very important that you put the thickener in after you've added your catalyst, because obviously if you add your thickener first,
it's beautiful, right? But it's not chocolate, that's the thing. And you wouldn't do this with chocolate. What would you do this with?
So I always add the silicon catalyst first, and then once that's thorough,
now,
then I'll add.
Okay. I'm having a moment. I'm psychologically disturbed by this. This is terrible.
Make sure that when I put some silicone on the surface, it actually stays in place. Now, the first couple...
His mold is going to be like 10 inches thick. I'm exaggerating, but what I would do is after I've filled in the ears and under the ears and over the nose and over the ridge, like I talked about, I would then have a small amount, maybe a pound of silicone, and I would thicken it, and then I would take a small spatula and I would put it on. And I wouldn't smear it like paint. I would put it on leave it. Put it on, leave it. And what that does is it builds up a thickness. Instead of taking one piece and smearing it and it gets thin again, I'd put it on thick, put it on thick. And that way I could control the thickness all over the statue. Otherwise, you're going to have thin spots, and then people are inclined to put much more silicone on than you would ever need. This is way too much silicone.
Of coats, we wanted them.
He could have covered the whole model with this amount of silicone, and it's expensive.
The details covered with a couple of layers.
So this rubbing in stuff, so he just dumped $5 of silicone around the outside edge in that one thing.
Deep sort of nooks and crannies.
This ear's a mess.
Covering the whole thing. And again, this time
he can't see where he's
I
at.
haven't put pigment in it. And so it's very easy for me to see.
I need a Valium.
So if you just alternate your colors as you go, that way you're fine.
The bottom of his bucket is terribly dirty now because he set it on the work table that's terribly messy. He's overbuilding this base. It's just going everywhere.
It is everywhere.
Even if he had a bigger workboard, I feel like he would have smeared it out. Why is he covering the whole workboard with this?
So the idea is to sort of put all of the silicone.
Does it matter to me? It doesn't matter to me. I'm being overreactive because I think when you watch a pro and you think what they're doing is okay and nobody says it's not okay. Look, there's people that know how to handle guns and people that don't. And so when someone knows how to handle a gun and they're out there shooting, and then someone else comes in and they're good at it. Could you imagine how that gun instructor feels when someone who picks up a gun for the first time is trying to teach you how to use a gun? It's just terrible. This is what I'm watching.
Yeah, the head. And then once it's there, try and smooth out
rubber guns.
The thickness all over. It's like
okay, if this doesn't look like a disaster to you, this is what a disaster looks like.
Feel a bit of plaster underneath. And
all that material around the nose,
it sort of scoops them up and
it just keeps sagging.
Silicone on the high points. The high points like the nose.
You can see the thin spots.
The ridge around the collarbone there. They tend to be
terrible. Okay.
When you're wiping and working over the surface, those are the bits that stick out. So they tend to get to wiped.
I'm trying to look ahead to see if it gets better.
Make sure those high points do get covered with the silicone.
This is.
I'm a big fan of using these wooden tongue sticks. I call them tongue sticks because they're the doctor would use to depress.
The tongue depressors are straight sticks, which means this is just a paint mixing stick from Home Depot. So if it was really short, your tongue depressor is like this, and you see where my hand is. So now my hand is going against the model when I'm trying to use the stick. This actually needs to be bent a little bit, so my hand is away from it. So in essence, I want this. I want to be smearing like this because I want to keep my hand away from the silicone. Tongue depressor sticks are, I don't know why they became so popular.
Press the tongue when looking down the throat, but you may know them as waxing spatulas.
You have no control.
Sticks, depending on how you come.
He's trying to keep his hand away. Okay. The whole time he was wearing gloves, and now he's not. I don't get it.
This kind of thing. And what I'm going to do with this tongue stick is, as the silicone is starting to set but not fully set, I just tend to drag all over the surface.
He's lost the orientation of the thickness of the material at this point. It's thick in some places, way too thick, and thin in other places.
So that it's a little,
I can see it.
Kind of like icing a cake, really.
This is a fun part, but
it's a pretty satisfying job to do.
Yeah, it is. The spoon won't glide well enough. It'll bunch up the material. But you see that edge? Okay. If he had done those edges at the very beginning,
now that we have that on,
he wouldn't have had to add another half inch.
I'm actually going to cut up some of this stuff. Now, I call this stuff scrim. Some people call it jute or fabric.
This is when mold makers are bringing timelines together. This is from like the 1800s. And then he's going to put it in with a modern day silicone. You just don't need mesh with the type of mold that he's making. You just don't. The silicone, if you select the correct silicone at the beginning, it's strong enough.
Burlap, but whatever you want to call it, this is stuff that's used a lot with plaster, and you normally get this where...
Not with silicone. You don't need it. And if you did need it, it would only be in certain areas that the mold was likely to tear.
The surface of the mold. So by cutting...
You don't need this. Now he's going to have to spend all this material to cover this up.
The entire surface.
It's a lot of extra work.
And I'm going to massage them into...
Massage. I like that.
Quite set yet. It's very important that you get it on there before it completely sets.
You don't need this.
Push down onto the scrim, and you'll see that the silicone underneath kind of squishes through the holes. That's what's great about this material, because the silicone will pass through and then basically it meshes it in there. And the reason we're doing this is to create a layer of reinforcements.
You don't need it.
Have to make the silicone too thick, but it's also
his silicone is already too thick.
So if you had to do multiple pulls out of a mold where you're going to be manhandling it,
When you have fabric in a mold, and it's over the whole mold, it causes problems later. It causes problems for trimming. It causes problems for coverage.
really cheap and it's really strong. But if you wanted something with a bit more flexibility, I would suggest
I never had trouble with molds tearing.
a net, which is like a mesh similar to
It's not exactly true.
much more flexible.
I had trouble with people who didn't know how to use molds tearing my molds,
Into the
but I never tore my own molds.
before it sets, so that you've got a complete sort of surface over the top that's covered, and it will create a much stronger mold.
He's got like 10 pounds of silicone on this.
Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cover this whole
Okay.
thing with cling film or ceramic.
Why?
Depending on what kind of stuff you have near you. And this stuff is just food plastic, food wrapping plastic.
It doesn't matter. Okay.
And then I can use a sponge.
Even if he didn't put on the plastic, he would just put on some silicone on top of it. And if he didn't have the mesh in there, it wouldn't have this texture. So now he's got to glaze over it to make it smooth.
To massage that in.
I'm going to have to show a lot of pictures
The reason I'm doing
of how to do this.
so that I can get a smoother surface.
It's so much faster than this.
Having to sort of put any kind of solvent or anything on the outside. So if you just smooth
The thing is, this is beautifully filmed. He's narrating it perfectly.
engage with the
He's describing exactly what he's doing for his technique.
dirty because
I'm in conflict with his technique.
and then you massage all that in, get that smooth, and then just leave the plastic in place overnight so that it completely sets up with the plastic in place. And then in the morning when we peel this off, we should have a smoother surface without any bits of
Have you ever seen those dogs when something like
silicone is set?
surprises a dog and their head goes like this?
Just have to cut those off. So by smoothing out like this, it's just a very sort of quick and economical way of
Economical, dude. This is one expensive.
whilst that's
Okay.
I'm actually going to make some keys.
This can tell you where someone's mind is at. There is somebody who's thinking one step ahead, and there's somebody who thinks 10 steps ahead. This is one step ahead, 2 steps ahead maybe. These tracks are just something from the hardware store. What he wants to do with them is to make keys, which I don't like, but I've done this technique. So here's the 10-step ahead thought. You get a bunch of these tracks, and you stack them all together into one big grid. So when you pour the silicone, you see how he's trying to follow one thing? Why didn't he at least put the two together? They're still on the same table. They would have filled much easier. And so this is a lot of work for himself.
So here you can see
fussy.
I've got some plastic channel. It's a kind of a U-shaped
You'd make the keys and you just use them when you need them.
hardware store. And what I've done
The other thing you can do is pour a slab of silicone and then cut keys from a blanket of silicone. This is messy.
these two channels with the silicone to make 2 long strips. So again,
Yeah.
just leave this overnight to set up. And then in the morning, I should be able to peel those out and I will have
My
2
ear
long
itches.
runs.
This is making me so nervous. My ear
Also, when you're
itches.
doing this stuff, you need to make sure you do it on a level worktop, because if the table is not level or the workshop table is not level, you're going to find that the silicone
It's a heavy
runs
key.
to one end more than the other.
Really heavy key.
silicone wedge
The deeper a key is they actually begin to work against you. A key should snap in pretty easy, but then it can become really hard to make all of the keys go in, and you may think you have a key set into the mold, so the silicone is sitting into the plaster, but there may be a key inside that's creating a bulge, and you don't know it.
And throughout.
I'll show pictures.
Basically got a long snake of silicone, which I can then cut up into little sections.
I wouldn't have done this.
The idea of cutting up these little sections is these are going to be used as keys later on. So it's a very quick and economical way of producing a lot of keys quickly.
So what you do is, if you're making keys like this, and I simply would have used a more shallow track. One is you have a full grid ready to pour per our previous conversation, and you just keep that around. And when he was doing his glaze coat, if he had extra silicone, he would have dumped that into his key tray, is what we used to call them. And then even if he didn't fill it up, he could laminate more on top of that. So it's one of those things you do with your excess material.
Without having to get any kind of expensive material in. So here you can see the silicone has set up, and I can peel away my cling film, and as you can see, I've got
Now you're just throwing away something you didn't need in the first place.
some texture to it, but I'm going to give it another coat of silicone anyway.
That silicone on the board is really sloppy.
To its own devices. If any bits are sticking up still that are in the
See, if he had controlled where he was pouring, he would have drawn that line around it, and then he would have put a little clay retaining wall right around that, so all the silicone naturally pulls down there, and it doesn't go to waste. Now it's just going to be wasted.
way, because sometimes
And he doesn't have an even flange.
get a perfectly smooth surface. You can
More scissor time.
with a pair of scissors and snip them out, but using the cling film has minimized how much of this I have to do.
Is he going to glaze it again?
So I quickly mix up another batch of silicone.
Oh, another batch.
Red in it, so it's
Another $50.
I'm going to use this final coat
Oh.
to smooth over the
When you put in those keys like this and they squish, you've now created an anti-key around the bottom, and you're going to have to clean that up because keys should be clean, easy things. And he cut them straight down. I would have cut the ends tapered like this so it releases a little bit better. But now he's going to have to clean up around his keys. I would make one long track in silicone that goes all the way around because the flange later has to fit over the plaster. You'll see. I'll wait till we get there.
partly to create a new layer here for the keys to stick into. So
It's a mess.
poured silicone should bond to freshly applied silicone.
It will bond.
And by squishing these in like this and then smoothing out the edges,
He's got too many.
basically
Way too many.
keys into
And they're too tall.
the surface, and they'll all sort of stick and
And that's not a glaze coat.
become one thing once they've all joined.
If he's putting a key in like this, at the very least, he could have taken his glaze coat and glazed over the keys so he would be sure that they would have bonded. Sometimes they can come detached from the flange. It's not common, but they do.
And you can see that it's very easy for me to navigate around curves.
At the same time, he's creating silicone to go like this because he's going to have a mold that comes over it, but
Expecting you to bend around all these corners.
it's so much material.
And sets up.
You can make 3 bust molds out of this material.
You know, the long strip of silicone would
And it's going to be so heavy to use.
into the corners and curves in the way I
Okay.
like to. So by cutting them up into sections, it's much
Now he's cleaning up these keys with that damn little tool.
And if they're too long, you can just trim them down and cut them shorter.
You can trim them down, but it creates an anti-key again.
Around the base of each key with a tongue stick and just smooth it out, just to check that there's no air bubbles and to get rid of any kind of folds or bulges of silicone that collect, because when you squish down the key into
How many views did this have?
silicone, it kind of displaces some.
300,000.
A big blob around the bottom edge.
There's 300,000 people who saw this. Maybe 10,000 who watched it.
And professional as possible. So once
To you, 10,000 people, there's a better way.
try and smooth it out. But before it completely sets, I've got one.
You see how you can bring that sleeve into the mess?
What I'm going to do is I'm going to use some dishwashing detergent. So here you can see I've just got some normal dishwashing or fairy
It's a nice trick. You can just use water.
detergent you can get a hold of. I've got some of that in a cup and I've mixed it with some water. I'm just going to stir it,
And-
and that's going to make basically like a slippery kind of lube that I can paint.
Yeah, I would have just used a spatula. This is perfectly fine.
Just smooth it with a
I never
brush,
used the
or
soap
indeed
though.
with your
I
hands.
don't know that you
And
need
if you
it.
do this as the silicone is setting, you can get a really nice
That's a lot he's putting on there too. You can see it dripping.
kind of finish on the outside.
You can stay awake through this one? It's okay.
It's cheap. It's very easy to find. It's very easily available. You can use something like ice.
If you wait for it at the right moment, you can use a glove in your hand, dip your hand in water, and smooth it over, and you have great control. That's the one time I would touch the silicone.
surface area. It's safer and sensible and cheaper for me.
So he keep creating texture, and then he would smooth it. Then he'd create texture, and then he'd smooth it.
Done. So now we're on to
He's
the
happy.
next stage,
That's good.
which is to let this set up completely, and then I can do the plaster jacket on the outside.
I call that the mother mold.
Preparation for that, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to trim
So now he's going to throw away
outside. So I'm going
all of this
to
silicone.
inch away from the keys and follow the shape as closely as I can.
Remember, I would have put a silicone rope all the way around where he's cutting it, and it would have risen up like a little shelf. So instead of these, like he has a railroad cars going around, I would have had one long snake further away from the sculpture, right there, and not as tall. We'll show pictures.
And with a scalpel, I'm just going to slice off the
A
excess.
scalpel. Whole cripes. Don't use scalpels. You don't need a scalpel. You could use a fettling, a potter's knife. Scalpels will cut you so deep and so clean that you're going right to the hospital with a scalpel cut.
And carefully peel it back.
Don't use scalpels.
So you can see now I've got a really nice, neat edge to the silicone. And you can even see the different layers of silicone as I've cut it through like strata in some kind of exposed rock face in the ground. Okay, so we're ready.
Plaster mother mold. Here we go.
So for this,
See, if you didn't know, it looks really good.
in two parts, I could probably make the
So
jacket that
heavy.
supports this in one piece, but if I was to fill that silicone later with a rigid material, I might have a hard time getting it out, or it might damage the mold trying to get it apart. So it makes sense.
His mold is so heavy over the ear area, ears are going to break when he unmolds it.
I need to use the mold lots of times. So if I make them
I like his workstation.
easy to open later, then I'm going to be very grateful that I took the time to do that. So what I'm going to do here is take some clay. This is water-based clay, just regular grey clay.
Okay.
And I'm going to use my clay cutter with a board.
Clay cutter.
Cut some slices of clay up. So they're about 10 millimeters thick.
That's a sexy beast.
Consistent.
Look at that. All right. I give him the MacGyver award. I don't know where these are sold or if he made them or he invented it, but that's really nice for small pieces because rolling them out and yeah, no, this is good. All right.
Cut them up into strips.
See, I'll share the love when there's love to share. Good ideas are good ideas.
To make a series of clay strips that I can use to make the clay wall. There are again lots of different ways of doing this. This is just my preferred method of doing it. So what I'm going to do is lay the strips around the outside here. And the reason I'm doing this is to
I would have done this at the very beginning.
clean wall so that the plaster doesn't go everywhere when I'm doing it. These are
He's a little late on the show on that one, right? I mean, so the plaster doesn't go everywhere.
makers would frown.
Granny walls, never heard them like that. It sounds like
A little bit easier, but it's also kind of
he's
lazy.
got a little mold wall shame there.
Skip this step if you'd rather not do it, but I am going to do granny walls on this.
I've never seen a granny mold maker, so she couldn't lift this thing. Weighs more than a wheelchair.
Up a little thickness, maybe about an inch or so all the way around. And
Extra cleanup.
This is a little small tool.
But it's nice that you can see the knife is stepped, so his hand. But why is he wearing gloves
And stuff with clay.
with water-based clay?
Once that's done in one half, I'm then going to lay my mold wall down the center.
That strip could have been one and done.
Because they're much easier.
He made them half as skinny.
Feed this stuff around corners and get it into all the nooks and crannies to follow the shape correctly and just build one.
He's doing it right. It's just extra work. Because his silicone is so freaking thick, I don't think he actually needed a mold wall that went everywhere. He could have just put knuckles because these mold walls are going to get bolted together. So you'll see as we go along that he didn't need one continuous wall.
Got the wall the correct height. It can get a bit fiddly in corners where you've got to cut it round to fit into the
Am I sounding too bitchy today? Did we do this too early in the morning? Okay.
things like that. But that's why I like to do little strips because it's very
So he's got 3 strips instead of 1.
cut the shapes into the clay at this.
That's 3 times this motion.
A very complicated shape into one big piece of clay. As you can see, being clay, it's very easy to add.
What you don't see is that clay doesn't want to stick to silicone. So you have to be very delicate in how you set it on there because it's going to want to slide off. You got to reinforce it from the other side. I would put little buttresses or plaster.
So layer upon layer upon layer, I build it all up. Make sure the wall is
Yeah, you got to have the mohawk. Yeah, that's good.
done. What I'm then going to do is go over the back side of it with some plaster bandage. So this is on the back. This is the side that I'm not going to mold up against.
Yeah, this is what keeps it from sliding off. It's not a bad idea.
Clay wall is strong so that when I
What I used to do is actually put the clay shell down first, the plaster shell down first, then I would build my clay parting wall onto the shell so the shell wouldn't slip. He's putting the clay on the silicone and then backing it. I just gave it a rigid surface at the very beginning to go onto. We'll show pictures.
push against it,
Both are very okay
I'm
ways.
going to do shortly, I don't want the clay to keep moving every time I push against it.
I like this idea.
Clay wall on this plaster bandage wall against the clay.
It's a little fussy
It's a temporary
because
wall, which is gonna
if he didn't trim his clay wall perfectly, now he's got to deal
as soon
with
as
this
that's set up
fabric.
and it's firm,
So
I can
don't
then
put
use
the
my
cl-
clay
don't put the
tools
plaster on until
to
you
kind
clean
of
up the
smooth things
wall.
out. Push against it to make it nice and neat. And because the wall
Mm-hmm.
is supported from behind with the plaster bandage,
Yeah.
it doesn't shift.
That's good.
It allows me to.
It's a lot thicker than he needed. If he was going to do the parting wall as he's doing it right here, his parting wall could be 3/4 of an inch thick, and then wherever he's going to have a mold key, make a knuckle to come bigger, and then lower. On the model, it should go skinny knuckle, skinny knuckle, skinny knuckle, skinny knuckle. And those knuckles are where his bolts are going to go to hold it together. Right, now he's going to build a plaster mother mold that is this thick because he's going to contour it because that's what the brain tells you to do.
Just drag
It's more weight. You'll never be able to lift this
really
mold.
nice finish. And as you can imagine, if you were doing this and halfway through the whole wall detached and moved because of the pressure you're putting against it, it's very frustrating. So that's why I put that bandage there to keep it in place.
He's right about
Tiny
that.
little nooks and crannies, you can just add more clay. The beauty of clay is that it all blends into itself. So just put in little bits of clay, smooth up against
I always used oil clay just because I didn't like throwing away water clay, but this is really nice to work with. And it's a little stickier than oil clay.
And then I'm going to add my keys.
Add your keys. What? I can't even figure out why he would do that. What you do is you take a loop tool that's 1 inch diameter and you scoop a trough where your keys are going to go. You don't add a key. You just cut the clay away. I'll show it. It's like you carve out a notch.
Unique shapes in the
Picture. There's a note for me at K to remember to show a picture of these.
time, so it's a very positive.
Now he's sculpting again.
That's why they're called keys. Sometimes they're called joggles.
Joggles.
Call them locators, but the idea
They're
is
called
to put
keys.
something into the wall, because obviously a flat surface, it's a bit ambiguous as to where exactly it should go.
That's fussy, right? For a key, it's like 2 seconds.
Work. You can be sure that when the two halves go.
So what you don't see is he had to roll out this clay, then he had to cut these beveled edges. Now he's putting it on there.
I often use a
And-
brush and a bit of water to help smooth out any bits and bobs.
I don't get it.
Working with clay like this, you've got to be very
Also, his key doesn't go all the way to the...
the clay wall that you've made. So
I'll talk about keys later.
keep things very
We can't teach it all in one time.
clay. So as I put my keys on, it occurred to me that the top of this mold would do a better job if it was flat.
This just occurred to him. Okay, I thought he was going to build a frame. He's talking about when the mold is upside down, what keeps it from spilling all over the table. I used to build frames out of PVC. I'll show a picture of that. It's very clean.
And then it would actually sit on a tabletop better,
Okay.
right angle. So I realized I hadn't done
What's going on?
I suddenly realized that we really...
So now he's got to cut through that plaster in the back.
After having done
He's created an obstacle for himself.
and then cut that off.
And then you're yanking knives around. I don't like doing that.
See it a bit later, this comes into play.
Okay. He's not wrong. It's just, well, okay, there he is. All you do is take a little Vaseline on the clay, and that's all you need. The less you have to spray in your mold making career, the better. The plaster is not going to stick to the silicone. The plaster is not going to stick to the clay. You could just use a little bit of soap on the clay for your cleanup, but don't spray.
This with a layer of wax. This is just an aerosol,
Don't spray.
a wax release spray. It's basically a beeswax that's
It's getting on your cameras.
with some propellant, and so you can spray
I
it
mean-
onto the surface, and you get a nice even fine coat of wax all over the surface without actually touching it. So here the plaster,
Without actually touching it. He's touched everything.
which is a reasonably hard plaster
I don't know this plaster.
in the UK.
Remember, use the fan trick, put a box fan in front of your plaster.
And then when I've got this kind of effect where it looks like a slightly dried, cracked riverbed, that's when I think there's enough plaster in there. It could probably do the tiny
Okay, you can mix this with a drill, stay clean.
running a mix on this one. So I'm going to mix this up really well into these bowls. They're called splash bowls over here.
I didn't know that.
Plaster.
They sell silicone bowls.
They're flexible so you can squeeze.
Okay, what's going on? You see, whenever you have dry plaster in a water, it hasn't been stirred. He's basically taken whatever is dry in the middle of that plaster, and now he's just created a lump. He's grabbed it and he's made a snowball. And inside of that snowball is dry plaster. And if you smear it, it's not its full strength. And then you got to put on more. So you don't mix plaster by squeezing.
To get rid of dry plaster later.
No, you just hit it with a drill.
Rounds, you can mix them up really, really quickly, and you can kind of pour. You can squeeze them
Okay, he's got his way.
for pouring as well. So they're really good bowls. These plaster is splash bowls.
I don't mold make with a watch.
So I'm going to brush in the first coat all over very quickly. Again, the idea, as we did with the silicone, was to get into all the details and get those
Correct.
points taken care of, especially around each.
You would call this the gel coat in the resin industry, in some ways.
Make sure you put plenty in there and brush
Yeah, those keys are going to be a problem.
bubbles and get a nice thin coat over it quickly. You don't have a long time with this. You probably got a good 10,
So
15 minutes before it starts.
you could have mixed in some chopped glass fibers into this.
On quickly, and you don't want to agitate the clay surface too much because your brush may disturb
I did that later. I never did it on the first
the
thing.
watery plaster with the watery clay and end up with a bit of a mess. So as it starts to
Plaster is tricky to work with. I used a different material, something called Forton MG. It was a hybrid between a gypsum cement and a fiberglass. and it was safe to work with.
Starts to thicken up. It gets this really nice kind of cheesy kind of state.
Cheesy.
First, like
More cheese, Wallace.
and
Okay.
then it kind of goes all sort of pasty, like kind of butter. And you can
I mean, look at this. He's like
tools to kind of strike off
cleaning
the edge. This
a Boeing
business here
747
of
with a
cleaning up the
Q-tip.
edges is
I
known as
mean,
striking
get the-
off. So
just use your brush. And why is it always a 1-inch brush? They sell 3-inch brushes. You know, just get it on there faster.
if you've got any bits overhanging the edge that are left unattended, they'll just
I know. It's a lot. This is a heavy mold. I'm thinking this is going to be 50, 60 pounds. It should be not more than 10. All in.
As this plaster's setting up, I start packing it in there, and I'm now going to use a slightly wet brush, just some water, to sort of take off any gnarly textures.
Use a bigger brush.
Smooth that out. And then once that's done, I'm ready for my next mix. I always tend to do this in 2 mixes. So the first mix is the first coat or the firstings.
Firstings. It's like a Hobbit. Firstings.
Details in there and to get a nice even thickness.
But he already did that side.
It tends to naturally
Okay.
settle into the deeper area.
Now I'm splitting hairs, you see.
You know, you want to try and keep it, I guess, about
You got to clean that ridge line. That'll save you trouble later.
an inch thick all over. Try and keep it thin because this
His flange is really heavy.
weigh a ton. Okay, so as that sets up, I go on my second coat. So this is
Second
now
coat.
on the-
Okay.
the second coat of plaster, and you can see
This is where I would put in chopped glass.
after it's kind of been
So the
is drying up.
fiber reinforcement is integrated into the plaster.
The second coat goes on to the first coat, the more it's going to stick. If I left it overnight, there'd be a good chance they
He's about to say, if you leave it overnight, it won't stick to itself. He's not wrong. It's just that if he had not have smoothed it out, it would have left a nice mechanical texture there. And then what you do is you come back the next day, you spray it for a few times with water, and then you can put more plaster on top. And the water prevents the new plaster from being sucked dry, and then the texture creates a mechanical lock. This is a mold making channel.
So I really want to get this second coat of plaster on there as fast as I can. And as soon as I brushed on a layer,
No.
I'm going to start dumping some pre-cut pieces of scrim or burlap,
You don't.
and I lay them on.
I don't know this plaster. Maybe it chips easy, but
And the outside edge first.
reinforcement is important. Otherwise, these shells are brittle and they'll crack.
For
But
the center,
he could have done that the last
pieces in
time.
over the edge, and then I tend to
Even more. Okay,
over the edges like this,
man.
so that they end up being rolled layers of scrim. So there's several layers thick on the
mean-
edge, and the edge is quite important.
So the molds that I used to make for the culinary industry, I had to ship them across the globe. And if I had built a mold this heavy, it wouldn't ship overnight very nicely. And then when the chef used it and they got it in the kitchen, they'd be like, why did this guy just send me a brick? You know, they would have been pissed. They needed to be able to handle this mold, and it needed to be clean because they were going to use it in a kitchen. And this is a freaking T-Rex.
Important part, because that's what you tend to grab hold of when you want to open the mold. That's where you're going to stick a screwdriver in and hit it with a hammer,
Look how messy that is.
clamps or bolts or something. So
He'll tame it,
to
but
get the most amount of punishment. So it makes sense for those to be really strong. So there's several layers of plaster and scrim on that. So that's going to be nice strong.
how many times are you going to use this mold?
And again, as it starts to set up, you can start cleaning up the edges. Now, as this second set is, the second layer is setting up, I also pull out the clay from underneath that I used.
Okay,
The first bit of clay I put around the edge here, I pull that away
it's trash.
so that I can actually get to the edge of the plaster and clean it up.
Look how thick that is, right? His wall didn't need to be that thick.
And, a wet brush to kind of smooth out that surface as we go. And if you can kind of treat the edges nicely and smooth,
He's right.
get a nice square
Make it smooth.
to kind of finish on those corners where the edges are. So a nice strong mold.
Okay.
It looks
You know, it's nice that we have this. He stays focused on the piece. I didn't get to see a shop though.
starting to set up.
I would have loved to see a shop.
Very set, so I can actually peel away the back. So I carefully remove the plaster bandage wall and the clay wall. I can now get to the other side. So now
Oh, that clay was worth saving.
first side, and you can see
Got those big keys. Now, what you should do with those keys is you should draw a line on the other side of the mother mold, because when you put this mold together, you're going to forget where the keys are, and either you can split the mold and cut through a key, or you can drill through a key. You don't want to put your compression bolts through a key.
And now there's these little depressions, which are the complete reverse.
Those keys are so biggie.
Plaster. And I can clean all that off. I'm going to use just a wet sponge to clean that down.
You only need this much shell,
As this plaster is setting up,
especially if you use the mesh.
stage, and that
Gloriously cheesy.
square everything off and make them neat. So as you can see, I'm going in here with the
Oh, he's adding more.
still liquid, but it's kind of setting. So there's
When is this house done?
where you can kind of paste it in there and take out any inconsistencies and make it smoother and neat. And then as it sets up, you just hit it with some wet sponge, or and you get that nice kind of smooth finish on the outside. So
I wonder how many mold makers have had to move their studio. When you have to move your studio and every mold that you made is 6 times as heavy as you wanted it needs to be, oh my God, things just go in the trash. It's too heavy.
mold wall there, you can
I thought shadow was coming up.
sort of residue of clay.
He's almost there, home stretch.
Stain of clay, like a light layer of mud, and because it's water-based clay, I just use a wet sponge and wipe that clean. Okay, it's very important to make sure that everything is clean, so I'm using
Why does he have that little chunk of clay there?
form or plaster rough.
The sure form is good.
Things down.
I wouldn't have cleaned up until after I'd sure formed. He's right about this. Always spray it with WD-40 before you use it.
Down can often get stuck inside the blades, and you want to clean that off before it has a chance to fully
Yeah, those they add up. And it's not that they're too expensive, it's just that when you need it and it's not sharp, you got to go buy one. You're like, damn it.
its most sort of softest state.
Yeah,
It
it's a
has
great
set,
tool.
but it's only just set, so it's much easier to shave down any bits and bobs you don't want now than if you
Bits and bobs. I'm going to start using that. Bits and bobs.
use full strength. And so shaving this stuff down is a real chore at that stage.
Oh, don't spray. Don't spray. What you do here is very simple. Along your plaster parting wall, you liquefy some Vaseline and you brush the Vaseline along the parting wall, over the top of the edge of the parting wall, and a little bit on the back, because your next plaster is going to go over and you just don't want it to bond and lock yourself together. This spraying is
So once this is done, I'm going to do
just burning products.
spray
There's times when you need spray, but this is not it.
spray wax over the exposed plaster.
Don't need it.
Next layer of plaster that goes on there will definitely come away nice.
Stays in the air. Where'd it go?
To dry for a couple of minutes, I guess.
It's going to go in the air and then it's going to go on the floor. Then he's going to step on it on the floor. It's going to go on his rug.
5 minutes in between each coat so that there's plenty of time for it to dry. You'll know it's dry when it goes matte. And then I'm going to do the same again. I put on a first coat of plaster.
Use a brush. There we go.
Same again. And then once that starts setting up, you can neaten it up.
Okay.
And then go on again with your
We get it.
string and
He's on it. He's going to overbuild it. Now, he shouldn't have used a wooden tool there. He should have used a metal knife to cut through what he locked together on the mold. This again. I mean, this is how they pack fossils when they ship them from, Africa. What do you think this sucker weighs? It's a lot, right? And it's not just what it weighs. He had to carry all of this material into his studio. And then a lot of it goes in the trash out of the
now
studio
the plastering is
or on the floor. Or what just happened?
in a couple of holes.
Look at that. That cross section of his dividing wall is almost the length of the entire drill bit. So you want to drill with at least a 1/4 inch drill bit, because you're going to put these 1/4 bolts with washers through there. But we don't know if he just drilled through a registration key.
because I want to use bolts to hold this mold together. I'm just going to use 2 long bolts, one at the top and one at the bottom of the mold.
He should have one in the middle if he's going to do it at all.
I'm just going to drill some
I would say three bolts minimum.
using a drill bit.
And you do have to go in and out like this because the plaster clogs the thread.
You're in there.
So you can't just go right through. You go in, out, wire brush, in, out, wire brush.
2. And then I can separate the 2 halves. I've got to use a screwdriver here to carefully pry them apart. And you can see that with a little bit of careful...
So you see how he's keyed his mold together. If you watch that carefully, the big keys along the bottom make him draw the mother mold off like in this direction. And you see how the corner catches his key at the bottom here. Because it didn't kind of slide off, he's having the mold fight with itself. Not in a big deal way, but these are the things that if he'd put more, he would have been in trouble.
Prying, you can get the two to separate. And
oh, it doesn't look as bad as I just described.
So there we go. You can see I've got some little bits of...
Oh, he drilled through two keys.
Which has sort of crept over the edge there. And I'm just going to smooth it out with some tools now. I can surform this off.
That plaster gets sharp as a knife. I would never run my hand like that.
Something, or craft blades just to...
It'll cut right through. It's so surprising. That is not a good move either.
And then make sure
there we go. That's better.
Bits that are sharp to the touch are sort of smoothed down now.
So this has been in the next day because it wouldn't have been this hard to cut.
Abrasive paper or wet or dry paper as well, that would work.
What he's doing is he's taking a sure form on his registration key. And I don't know that I would want the things that I'm counting on for mold alignment to have any sort of wiggle room. It's not a big deal here, but in general, you don't spend a lot of time changing the shape of your key after you've made it.
And here you
oh my God,
two halves go.
That's a dinosaur.
They're pretty good seam.
It's a beast.
The jacket made, and because it's in two parts, like I say, you can treat it as a one-piece mold, but if you do need to get it apart for any reason, you can just take those two bolts out.
He looks like a pretty beefy guy, so he you know, you'd have to be to do this.
So you won't have a seam on there. It's just on the outside on the jacket.
All right, put those bolts through.
So here I'm going to put the molds together with, or the mold.
You see, this is another thing, is where he chose to pull the bolts. If he had gone any closer to the bottom, he now is not thinking 2 steps ahead, because the washers, sometimes you can put the keys, and you can't twist your wing nuts right there.
Halves together with a bolt, and I'm going to
see how close that was?
To spread the load and also to stop the fact that the spinning of the nuts could damage the surface of the plaster every time you're unbolting it and bolting.
You need to have washers on both sides.
These big washers are really handy to spread
He's
the load and to stop it digging in. So now over to the silicone.
This is going to be hard to unmold. He's going to have to use strength.
And it's flexible, so it just peels off, and basically you just go around the outside surface.
Snap the ear.
And then I just hold it down the middle and just pull it completely off the face, and the plaster face.
I mean, look how thick that is.
This is the original plaster face. It's largely undamaged. The ears did break off, but that's inevitable because, you know, they're
the ears, yeah,
the pieces that stick out. But it doesn't.
So I would put a cut in the mold there for the next time molding, unless he's doing latex. But he's still got a lot of cleanup.
Matter, because the thing is, we've got them.
Wait, why didn't he save the pieces? You reattach them to your model. What just happened?
This is our completed.
Save those.
We have a little bit of silicone that crept underneath the plaster around the edge here, so I'm just going to go in and trim that off. And then I can put this back into the plaster jacket. So to help the plaster jacket, or to help the...
Yeah, you can... This is the place where I don't use Vaseline, because Vaseline, at some point, if you want a permanent release, it doesn't. It creates it gets sticky afterwards. And so this is the part where I would seal it. I would use polyurethane parting compound. You can use some sort of acrylic sealer or something like that.
Silicone sit into...
Oh my God, he's using talc. Why would you use talc? You don't want to breathe that.
Jacket, because it's quite grippy. I just use a bit of talc, and that'll help lubricate the surface.
Okay.
So that the silicone can slide in.
This is what I was talking about 3 hours ago. Is now he has these keys that he's got to push in there, and if he had had that little rope of silicone all the way around the edge, he would have just pulled it over, like putting on a stocking, and he just pulled it over the edge, and then his mold would be totally tight and totally clean. The other thing is there'd be no gaps between the silicone and the mother mold. Watch what happens here. I'm predicting.
To place. And these keys...
See how they
just need to be fixed.
Some of them snap in, some of them don't.
And once the silicone is correctly located and sat in there, that should stay in there quite happily.
What you see is that because his flange doesn't go over the sides of the mold, there's a space for plaster or casting material to go between the silicone and the mother mold and throw it out of registration. Because once you cast it, and you strike the mold, stuff starts flowing over the edge. Now, because I used to make a lot of molds for chocolate, that was the thing, is that these guys would strike it and chocolate would go everywhere, and then they would mess up their mold.
And there you have our...
This is a neat optical illusion. Look at that. Remember the sculptures that I made, photographic negative, and this is not a pipe? Well, if you stare at this long enough, you'll see the positive. Yeah, the positive, and it will become more and more so. Watch.
So out of this, we can produce multiple copies of faces. In different
Has your brain
materials.
calibrated it?
Pieces out in resin or different kinds of foam, or we could make, you know, a dozen different faces if we needed lots of different sculptors to work on the same face at the same time.
Okay.
We're not worried about any damage to our original life.
We're almost done.
Now we have an exact copy of the original in silicone, and we can make as many as we need from this mold. Fabulous. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that was useful to you.
This guy knows what he's doing. I think as much as I do it differently, he has the ability to make something that is commiserate with his shop. Like, he'll make everything that he makes work. Ultimately, his work was clean, and I think that he's a guy who's more interested in the casting from the mold than the mold itself. So remember, I am mold biased. I'm always, the things that I used to sell was the molds, not the castings. So my molds had to be extra, extra special. But there are things when you watch a professional make a mold that if someone else is not commenting on it, you may think that that's the best practice, the GMP, good manufacturing practices, right? There's a funny thing. But this works, but there's another way. I'm going to do my best to put in a lot of pictures from the books that I wrote that will help explain this. And I say the books that I wrote, remember my story. I didn't like the contracts, but we may print them. I did write one book that went to print, Confectionery Art Casting. I don't know if it's still available. It was a book I wrote in 2003 for chefs. So it has good mold making practices, but it's for chefs, you know. So thank you for watching. Please send us some mold videos, because I don't want to sound like an old guy bitching about everything, but I do want you to learn, if at all possible, 1 or 2 tricks from each video. And just tune me out if I'm sounding ridiculous otherwise. But I hope it wasn't so ridiculous that you'll watch another one. Stay with us. Thank you for watching this video. We're getting ready to launch a new platform called Hand-ufacturing. It's going to feature a lot more educational films about mold making and casting, from very basic to advanced mold making. Our hope is that it helps the business entrepreneurs out there learn efficient ways to manufacture their products and bring a lot more wealth into their household. Stay tuned.